Patch 8.3 is on the PTR. Patch 8.3 includes a large new raid, Ny'Alotha the Waking City. The first boss from Ny'Alotha was tested on October 11th, and more bosses are being tested later this week. I'm Jeath, I'm a healer in Method, and I'm going to talk a little bit about raid testing on the PTR. The PTR is the public test realm. This server is where Blizzard tests changes to World of Warcraft before pushing them into the live game that you and I actually play. Anyone can access the PTR simply by installing it from their Battle.net app and then launching the game. Currently, Blizzard is testing patch 8.3 on the PTR. Almost all aspects of patch 8.3 are available for testing. This includes new world events in Uldum and the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, where both of the raid entrances are. These events relate to N'Zoth's invasion of Azeroth, and both zones are under continual assault by the rise of the Black Empire. You can also test brand new essences for your Heart of Azeroth, and various class and spec changes. Probably the most important part of PTR testing for Method is raid testing. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about raid testing. I've heard people claim that Method and other top guilds get to thoroughly practice new bosses on the PTR for as long as they want, but that's not how it works. The hardest difficulty in the game, Mythic difficulty, where Method competes for World First, is typically tested for 1 hour per boss. Blizzard will open up a specific boss to be tested at a specific time on a specific day. For example, from 1 to 2 o'clock on October the 11th. The boss can only be accessed for that single hour. Sometimes a boss won't work correctly, and it may be tested a second time for another hour. Bosses are also tested on heroic difficulty, again, usually for 1 hour per boss. During that time, anyone is free to log on the PTR, make a group, pull the boss, and see what they can see. But during each hour-long boss test, Method has a lot to do. We're trying to get every bit of information we possibly can in the brief time. Anyone can read about the boss mechanics in the dungeon rule, but during testing, we can gather information about how frequently a boss ability occurs, or what deadly combinations of mechanics may occur at the same time. With this information, we can start thinking about strategies of how to deal with these mechanics. Raiders can also gain a little bit of familiarity and practice with how the mechanic works and how to perform them. We can also get a good sense for what kind of damage is required to kill the boss. Is this a pure single target boss? 2 separate targets that need to die at the same time? Are there multiple targets that require cleave, or a bunch of little adds that need to be AoE downed? Is there a burn phase that requires extremely high burst DPS in a short time? This kind of information can help give Method a sense of what kind of classes and specs we need to prepare for the new raid. For example, guilds testing Queen's Court from the most recent Race to World First in the Eternal Palace quickly learned that Shadow Priests would be extremely valuable due to their ability to gain enormous amounts of DPS from having 2 permanent targets. Another important part of boss testing is just throwing spells and mechanics and seeing if they do anything. Does Ice Block or Divine Shield do anything to change how a mechanic works? What about Tremor Totem, or Mass Dispel, or Blessing of Freedom? Basically, every raider is responsible for testing as many different things as they can think of to see if their utility or niche spells have an impact in helping to overcome a challenging mechanic. A good example of this was on Blackwater Behemoth from the most recent Race to World First. During testing, you could learn that the Piercing Barb, cast on Mythic difficulty, does not need to be soaked by most of the raid if the target has an immunity, like Ice Block or Divine Shield. PTR testing also provides a valuable opportunity to test how classes work after the sometimes extensive changes made during major patches like 8.3. For example, Shadow Priests have had large nerfs announced in 8.3. During PTR testing, we can find out how bad or good the class remains for particular kinds of damage patterns. This also includes testing any new powers, such as the several new Heart of Azeroth essences being added in 8.3. We test as much of this as we can in the hour that we have, so that when the raid is released on live servers and we begin racing for World First Mythic N'Zoth, we're as prepared as we can be for each boss fight's unique mythic mechanics, and the compositions that we want to run for them. During this period of PTR testing, we're testing the bosses in the new tier, Ny'Alotha the Waking City. The first old god to perish in Azeroth was Y'Sharj, whom the Pantheon of Titans killed long before any of us got involved. The second, Cthulhu, was defeated by champions of Azeroth in the Encourage raid and Vanilla WoW. The third old god, Yogg-Saron, was the final boss of Ulduar in Wrath of the Lich King. The final old god, N'Zoth, has been lurking on the edges of the game throughout the past several expansions, but after surviving through the Cataclysm, Mists of Pandaria, Warlords of Draenor, and Legion, N'Zoth will finally be confronted by you, me, and our friends as the last boss in Ny'Alotha the Waking City. It's about time. There are two entrances to the raid itself, one in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms and the other in Uldum. Both of these zones are under continual attack by N'Zoth's Black Empire. There are 12 encounters in the Ny'Alotha raid, several of which look extremely interesting. Those of you who played in Mists of Pandaria will recognize Raytheon, the Black Prince, for whom you performed many tasks and who gave you various powerful pieces of gear, as the first boss of the new raid. Another familiar figure from Mists of Pandaria making an encore in Ny'Alotha is Ra-Den, who was previously a hard mode only boss from Throne of Thunder. He has apparently been corrupted by N'Zoth and appears as the 9th boss of the new raid. Additionally, we will fight Il'gynoth for the second time in this raid. Il'gynoth is a nightmare manifestation that we first defeated in the Emerald Nightmare during Legion. He returns in Ny'Alotha as the last encounter before we face N'Zoth himself. As an old god-related raid, Ny'Alotha comes with a lot of familiar-looking architecture and art, present in both Uldum and the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. We see nightmarish and insectoid creatures, spires and towers reminiscent of Ahn'Qiraj, and, of course, lots of tentacles. Although old god-related monsters and bosses have been appearing for the past several expansions, this is the first true old god that we'll fight since Wrath of the Lich King. He's been whispering at the edges of the game for years, and I am excited to take him down. There are 12 boss encounters in Ny'Alotha the Waking City. That's exciting because the past several raids have had far fewer. There were 8 bosses in the Eternal Palace, 2 in Crucible of Storms, 9 in Battle of Dazar Alor, and 8 in Uldir. The 12 encounters in Ny'Alotha include a couple of dragons, some Akir, a giant multi-headed dog, an actual giant, a manifestation of nightmare, and of course an old god. Some of the bosses have mechanics that we haven't yet tested that look extremely interesting and potentially very difficult. The first one I'll mention is extremely simple, extremely deadly, and usually extremely detested by DPS players. Maut, the second boss, has a mechanic called Obsidian Skin in which he protects himself with a mana shield. While the mana shield persists, he will do 100% of the damage that you do to him back to you. This is what's known as a reflect mechanic, and it causes severe heartburn among DPS, who are forced to either slow down their damage, moderate their DPS, or die. Or, of course, secret option number 3, yell at the healers. Another interesting looking mechanic occurs during the Dark Inquisitor Zanesh fight. The Void Ritual mechanic designates 3 players to basically play golf with a Void Orb. Those 3 players touch the orb, sending it in the direction they're facing. The goal is to send it through a portal without hitting anything else. Bad aim could cause the boss to enrage and wipe the raid. N'Zoth himself is fought in 2 separate encounters. The Carapace of N'Zoth, as the penultimate encounter, and N'Zoth the Corruptor is the final encounter. This isn't the first time we've faced an extraordinarily powerful foe in 2 encounters in the same raid. You may remember in Cataclysm, we fought Deathwing first on his back in the Spine of Deathwing encounter, and then faced the Madness of Deathwing as the final boss. Many players agree that the overall fight against Deathwing was a mixed bag, with Spine being a difficult and fun encounter, but Madness ending up pretty unsatisfactory. Hopefully this time both portions of the N'Zoth fight are epic, difficult, and fun. Now, all of the bosses I've talked about will be tested in the upcoming weeks as Blizzard ensures that they all work as intended, and top guilds get as much information as they can to race for World First. But it's worth talking about one more aspect of PTR testing. Importantly, Blizzard does not test the final boss of a new raid on Mythic difficulty. This ensures that the final most important boss, the boss that will take the majority of progression time to kill, always has some surprises for World First guilds. For example, on the most recent World First kill of Queen Ashara, the fact that the mythic mechanic, a cutting beam through the middle of the room that kills anyone it touches, moves rotating around the room in the last phase, was a complete surprise that no one knew was going to happen. These surprises on the last boss can be extremely impactful. A good example of this is the first 2 end bosses of this expansion, G'huun and Jaina. For example, on Heroic Jaina, in Battle of Dazerlor, mages could ice block off stacks of Chilled Touch, the mechanic that, as it stacked too high, inevitably killed you in the last phase of the fight. But because Mythic Jaina was never tested on the PTR, guilds did not know until they reached that phase that on Mythic difficulty, no immunity would remove those stacks. A guild that relied too heavily on building a strat around immuning off those stacks would find itself surprised and unprepared for the reality of the fight. Another good example of this was Gahun from Uldir. A vital part of this fight was picking up an orb and carrying it to a receptacle. On Heroic difficulty and during testing, players could use mobility cooldowns like a Mage's Blink to quickly carry the orb where it needed to go. But because Mythic Gahun was never tested on the PTR, guilds had no idea that on Mythic difficulty players were suppressed, prevented from using any spells at all while carrying the orb. No blink, no sprint, no mobility whatsoever. So a guild that relied too heavily on building a strat around having a lot of mages and other hyper-mobile classes solo carry the orb would find itself needing to quickly reevaluate how to handle that mechanic and what classes to use on the fight. And of course, famously, a very few bosses have a secret mythic-only phase that surprises players when they first encounter it. A famous example of this is the Imperator Margok encounter in Heimal from Warlords of Draenor, where after you kill the Imperator and might believe you had defeated the final boss, instead, a new phase begins with a new foe. This time, though N'Zoth will be tested on Heroic, no one knows what will change on the Mythic difficulty guilds will be racing to kill world first. Will there be seemingly small changes to Heroic mechanics that dramatically impact strategy or composition? Or will there maybe one of those rare, exciting, secret and mythic-only phases? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below, and tell us also what you think about the raid overall. As always, remember to like or dislike this video, and subscribe to not miss out on future content. I'm Jeath, and you can catch me streaming at twitch.tv/Jeathabel. Thanks for watching everyone. Have a great day.